going to show you how to put a binding on using your Anova Longarm. And I have my prepared binding here. It's 2.5 inches wide, folded in half and pressed. And then I miter the end of it by just simply pressing over a 45-degree angle and then folding it in half again. The end of it looks like this, but I'll show it to you close up once we get stitching this binding on. And you'll need a straight ruler. I'm using Linda Hershka's The Quilted Pineapple straight edge. Your scissors, obviously, and your ruler plate on your Anova sew head. So with that said, let's get stitching the binding on. Okay, so let's get stitching this binding on. What I do is just like putting on a binding on your regular domestic machine, you line the raw edges up together. And here's a peek at the inside. I just folded a 45-degree angle and pressed it, and then pressed it over again. So I also wanted to show you, I think you can see this on this dark fabric. You can't see it when it's up against the white fabric, but there's a number of horizontal and vertical lines on this ruler. And I place the edge of this ruler right against the hopping foot. And then I move over 3 marks, 1, 2, 3, right here, and I line that third mark right up even with the folded edge. I'm going to go ahead and bring my threads up. I'm going to take a couple stitches, line this up. I line up the third line on my ruler right against the folded binding, and it's right up against the hopping foot, and the hopping foot is right up against the raw edge. And that will maintain a good 1/4 inch seam. I'm going to go ahead and stitch this down. Needle position is always down when I'm custom quilting too. Because there's times I'm going to have to stop. Now, one of those horizontal lines I lined right up against the raw edge of the bottom of the quilt because I'm going to stop a 1/4 inch away. And there's a dotted line indicating that's my 1/4 inch. So I'm going to pull it down. Once I get to that 1/4 inch away from the bottom, I'm going to stop, just like putting a binding on using your domestic machine. And this time, without taking my quilt out, just move my sew head off to the side, enough so that I can miter my corner, just like you would putting on a regular binding. That's as simple as that. Then, once I get that lined up, I'll bring my sew head back over. I want to line my hopping foot right up against the raw edge of my binding. Take a couple tack stitches, and then I'm going to line up my ruler using that third line again. I'm going to make sure that's lined up all the way down my binding. And I'm not actually watching my hopping foot, I'm watching that line. I wanted to show you when I come down the bottom edge of the quilt, I tend to lean over the machine to the left and hang on to my ruler, so my left hand is kind of wrapped around the back side, and I'm just pulling the machine right along, keeping that line lined up and my hopping foot up against that ruler. I'm pressing down on my ruler, keeping that line in position. So here we are, almost at the end of the bottom row, and I'm going to finish stitching this. I'm going to finish stitching this out. I want to make sure I have a vertical line right up against the edge of the quilt, and I have a 1/4 inch line right inside, and I know when to stop. Move my sew head out of the way. If my hand wasn't in the way for you. I miter my binding just like normal. And line it back up. Bring my sew head around. Take a few little tacking stitches, making sure my hopping foot is right up against that raw edge. Okay, I have my camera set off to the side so I can show you this without getting my arm in the way, hopefully. Just came around the very top edge, coming back to the beginning point, which is right here. And I'm going to stitch it down a little bit farther, maybe to about right here, so I don't get too close to the beginning. And then, so let's see. See where I am. I'll go a little bit more. Then I'm going to put my sew head out of the way for a second. I'm going to take a moment here and trim this little extra. I could have done it at the beginning, and you may want to also. And I just kind of eyeball, not very well, a 1/4 inch seam. So move that out of the way. Just reduces some of the bulk, and that's what I'm after. And then I bring my sew head back down, and I want to stitch this inside area down a bit. I don't have to go all the way down here, but what I want to do is make it nice and taut, so when I put the little end in, it's nice and even and doesn't have any extra fabric. I'm not going to take a 1/4 inch seam stitch. I'm just going to go in a little bit. And I just want to pull that up. And secure that down. So that's not going to shift when I put this in. Okay, now I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to cut an angle. Enough left over so that I can slip it inside. I'm going to stitch this part down before I stitch this down. And the only reason I want to do that is because I want to make sure it's nice and tight and no fullness. So I'm going to go back up here. I'll go over a 1/4 inch, get my ruler back out. This little piece is moved out of the way, so all I'm stitching is into the open end. I'm going to go ahead and stitch this. Take it out. And you have your binding completely stitched onto your quilt. I recommend before you sew the binding onto the back, hand stitch it on the back, that you take a little hand stitching tacks and secure this little open end. And then turn it over. When you're sewing your binding on the back, you're going to want to also sew this closed. So that is it. So I hope you enjoyed this little lesson on putting the binding on your quilt using your Nova. It's such an easy thing to do. It just takes a little bit of practice. I think the hardest for me is the bottom edge, kind of leaning over and taking a look at that. The top edge seems to go pretty slick and the sides are great. It's really easy to do. So hope you enjoyed that little tutorial.